Chapter 176. Tang Yu personally sent Pei Chichi to school, and the car drove all the way to the campus. At her insistence, he picked a low-key Audi. After driving for a while, Tang Yu suddenly handed her a box. Pei Chichi was stunned when she opened it. The watch she was wearing had been taken away by Tian Tian last time. And this one was brand new, and the style was slightly different. She reached over and rolled up his shirt a little. She saw that he was wearing a brand new watch on his wrist. It was a pair. Pei Chichi could roughly guess his feelings. It would be a lie to say that she wasn't tempted. She once read a book about a girl who didn't love a rich man, but that man continued to buy her the most expensive things. She liked French roses, so he chartered a private plane to transport a plane full of French roses to the country, and they filled up the house. Later on, the story was very cliché. The girl finally fell in love with someone else, forgetting her first love, who was as poor as a church mouse, and fell in love with her rich husband. Pei Chichi used to think that girls were materialistic, but now she understood that the girl was moved by her husband's infatuation. She looked up at Tang Yu. Childish. She really didn't think that he liked such a high-profile man. Tang Yu's gaze was focused on the road ahead, and he said very casually, "I also think that I'm too reserved. Pei Chichi, why don't we watch some childish things together tonight?" He held the steering wheel with one hand and touched his smooth chin with the other. "Well, I'll get Ching Cheng to download it. He has a lot of such things." Pei Chichi blushed, and she quickly glared at him. Tang Yu felt it, but he only smiled faintly. Very good, she had improved. She actually dared to glare at him. His car drove into B City's school. When the guard saw him, he opened the door to the fullest to let Tang Yu's car in. Tang Yu didn't directly send Pei Chichi to the classroom, but went to the principal's office. The principal bowed his head politely for a while, and then handed over a thick document. Tang Yu took it and flipped through it. Pei Chichi stood beside him like a child. She didn't dare to act rashly in front of the principal, but she couldn't help but take a look. Tang Yu rolled up the documents and knocked on her little head. "All right, let's go out." When he walked outside, Pei Chichi bravely snatched it over. She was stunned as she looked at it. "Exam papers. Pei Chichi, you'd better grow up." Tang Yu smiled faintly. "I'm now the director of this school. What's the big deal about taking a test paper?" Pei Chichi was quite excited because she didn't want to repeat a year either. "Well, I'll take it away first. I'll look at it slowly tonight." Tang Yu pinched her little nose and looked at the wound on her face. The wound on his face was very shallow and almost invisible. He reached out and touched it. "Be good, don't run around." Pei Chichi nodded. "I'll go to class then." She carried her bag and walked along the wooden cotton path in front. Tang Yu just looked at her like that. His gaze was a little distant. Suddenly, she turned around again and looked at him. Tang Yu smiled faintly. Pei Chichi waved at him. She walked backward and kept looking at him. This was the Pei Chichi he had never seen before. His heart warmed, and he couldn't help but laugh. "You're just a little kid." He kept standing until she turned the corner and couldn't see him anymore. The phone in his pocket rang. He didn't answer it immediately, but raised his hand to look at the time. He was already late. Chapter 177. When Pei Chichi entered the classroom, the originally quiet classroom fell silent. She looked up and accurately met Chen Xinjie's face. After that incident, they had almost never crossed paths. Pei Chichi walked to an empty seat and sat down. It was the girl beside her who said softly, "Today, King Entertainment came to our school to cast." King Entertainment. No matter how ignorant Pei Chichi was, she knew that it was the leading entertainment company in the country. Almost 60 to 70% of the country's A-listers came from King Entertainment. She didn't care too much, just smiled. Look, Pei Chichi wasn't so cold. She was quite cute. But she didn't seem to care about that. She knew that King Entertainment was going to choose a newcomer to be the female lead of the popular singer Lin Jiqian's music video. Of course, she had to look pure and pretty. Pretty, pretty, pretty. She felt that Pei Chichi was very suitable. But Pei Chichi's, that boyfriend probably wouldn't agree. Pei Chichi's arm was still hurting. She made some simple notes. After class, She sat in the classroom. She lowered her head and organized the notes she had borrowed from others, copying them page by page. But she didn't know that the people from King Entertainment had already arrived. Qin Anlan stood at the door, watching quietly. He was surrounded by over 10 people in charge. There were people from King Entertainment and leaders from B Academy. He saw Pei Chichi at first glance. It wasn't because of her quiet appearance, but because of her stunning beauty. After half a day, they had already interviewed over 10 beauties, but Qin Anlan still hadn't found the one he wanted. The newcomer this time wouldn't just be the female lead of a music video. King Entertainment would put in a lot of effort to package her. That was why they were looking at B Academy. What he wanted was a star with both beauty and intelligence, not an idiot. The leader of the school looked at Qin Anlan. His heart trembled and he lowered his voice. "Young Master Qin, that's not possible." Qin Anlan asked casually, "Why? Does he have a deep background?" The school leader wiped the sweat off his forehead and leaned closer. "It's a little deep. They're from Sheng Yuan." After 2 seconds, Qin Anlan roughly understood what he was trying to say. Tang Yu's men? He had been abroad for the past few months and had missed such a wonderful event. Tang Yu kept a female university student. Qin Anlan had been holding a cigarette in his hand, but he didn't light it. At this moment, his fingers moved slightly and pinched the cigarette in half. "I want her." How could this be? The leader was about to go crazy. Mr. Tang had even come to school this morning. It was obvious that this young lady was very important to him. How could he allow her to show her face in public like that? But they didn't dare to stop Qin Anlan. Although Qin Anlan wasn't in business, King Entertainment, which he controlled, dominated B City and even the country's top media. Just the fact that Pei Chichi was Tang Yu's mistress was spread out would have a bad reputation for B University. Qin Anlan walked over. His slender and good-looking fingers tapped on the table in front of Pei Chichi. He also saw the name on her book. Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi looked up and saw an extremely good-looking face. In terms of looks, he and Tang Yu were on par, but Tang Yu's face was of the Forbidden Jade series. He looked like an extremely noble person, but Qin Anlan's eyes and brows were tainted with the smoke of the world. Especially the tear-shaped mole at the corner of his eye, it was very alluring. Chapter 178. Qin Anlan had seen his fair share of beauties, but he had to admit that Pei Chichi's looks were indeed rare. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was a once-in-a-century beauty. Therefore, even someone like Tang Yu, who had a pure heart and few desires, was moved. What surprised Qin Anlan the most was that he knew that he was also very good-looking. Whenever a woman saw him, they would always want to throw themselves into his bed. In addition to his extraordinary background, his appearance was also an important reason. However, when Pei Chichi saw him, her gaze was very clear. There wasn't a hint of emotion, not even a hint of amazement. Qin Anlan handed over a business card and said very softly, "If you're willing, I hope that you'll be the female lead this time." Everyone in the classroom sucked in a breath of cold air. Oh my God, is this a direct decision? No audition, no talent show? Pei Chichi looked at the business card under his beautiful fingers. King Entertainment's CEO Qin Anlan. After a few seconds of silence, Pei Chichi directly rejected, "I'm not willing." Her reply was very stiff, as if she didn't give Qin Anlan any face at all. However, Tang Yu's woman naturally didn't need to give face to others, and she wouldn't even take a second look at such an opportunity. Qin Anlan's gaze fell on the chain around Pei Chichi's neck. His gaze was a little deep. After a long time, he smiled faintly and said, "I'll wait for you." Pei Chichi looked back at him. "I don't need it." Qin Anlan's body moved slightly closer to her and he smiled. "You'll need it, I promise." The school leaders heaved a sigh of relief. So he wasn't going to force her? With that said, Qin Anlan straightened his body and said to the staff beside him, "You don't have to choose anymore, it's decided on Pei Chichi." Qin Anlan's lower lip twitched as he walked towards the door. There was an unexpected reward today. Tang Yu's little mistress. The director followed behind pitifully. Young Master Qin, the girl didn't agree either. Then wait for her to agree indefinitely. Qin Anlan smiled. She will agree eventually. The director wiped his sweat and said, then Lin Jiqian's disc. Qin Anlan had already walked to the corridor outside the classroom. He stood by the armrest, looking down from above. He was wiping his hands with a snow-white handkerchief. Just now, a few girls had purposely rubbed against him a few times. He slowly wiped until he felt that it was clean. Then he threw the handkerchief to the director and said lightly, then we'll wait indefinitely. The director didn't say anything else. Qin Anlan smiled and said to the assistant beside him, think of a way to find a photo of Pei Chichi. I want King Entertainment's future newcomer on tomorrow's headline. Of course, this headline was not for others, but for Tang Yu. Thinking of Tang Yu's expression, Qin Anlan smiled again. The director couldn't understand. This clearly wasn't young Master Qin's style of doing things. He never supported people without ambition. Take that international Zhong for example. Many people didn't think highly of her, but young Master Qin said she had ambition in her eyes that most people didn't have. She was usually a pretty vulgar person, but in front of the camera, she was so beautiful. Qin Anlan seemed to be in a good mood. He turned to the director and said, Director Zun, Pei Chichi is an exception. Her earth-shattering beauty would cause a huge wave in the entertainment industry. Besides her beauty, Qin Anlan also found a rare tenacity in her eyes. This little girl would never be willing to be Tang Yu's little plaything. Chapter 179. When the people from King Entertainment had all left, the classroom was dead silent. Pei Chichi was still taking notes with her head lowered. These things had no effect on her. She was against the entertainment industry. She had already sold herself to Tang Yu once. She didn't want to appear on the big screen and become the target of other people's fantasies. And she knew that Tang Yu wouldn't agree either. She wouldn't overthink things that were impossible. But in the midst of the silence, a shrill voice rang out, Congratulations, Chichi. You've climbed to the top again. Pei Chichi's body froze and the pen in her hand paused. She looked up at Chen Xinjie. Chen Xinjie looked at her coldly, her eyes full of malice and indignation. Why did all these good things happen to Pei Chichi again and again? The heavens favored her and always gave her surprises. And herself, she wasn't any worse than Pei Chichi. She liked Lin Jinrong earlier and deeper than Pei Chichi. For Lin Jinrong, she could betray her best friend. She could use underhanded methods like Pei Huan to sleep with him. She slept with him and successfully disgusted Pei Chichi. But now, she wasn't happy at all. Chen Xinjie walked over. There was hatred in her eyes, but she didn't suppress her voice. Pei Chichi, have you fallen in love with Tang Yu? Otherwise, why couldn't she find a trace of sadness in Pei Chichi's eyes when Lin Jinrong got married? She even enjoyed Tang Yu's love with a clear conscience. And now she had the appreciation of King Entertainment's CEO. Pei Chichi's life was like a cheat code. Chen Xinjie was indignant. She's clearly an illegitimate daughter. Pei Chichi, what right do you have to get so much? Yes, she did it on purpose. She wanted everyone to know that Pei Chichi didn't have a mother. She was an illegitimate child. The classroom gasped. Pei Chichi was an illegitimate child. For a moment, there was a lot of discussion. Pei Chichi looked up and saw Chen Xinjie's malicious gaze. She was no longer in the mood for class. She slowly packed up her things and quietly looked at Chen Xinjie. She faintly smiled and said, "This is probably compensation from the heavens." She packed her bag, lowered her eyes, and dialed Tang Yu's number as she walked. On the other side, Tang Yu was in the middle of a meeting when his phone suddenly rang. He furrowed his brows. Everyone was also wondering which idiot would turn on his phone during such a meeting. Xiao Ran was also stunned, but she quickly came back to her senses and reminded him in a low voice, "President, it's your phone." Tang Yu retracted his gaze and picked up his phone. It was Pei Chichi. Xiao Ran would never admit that she was laughing. She watched as Tang Yu walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. All the higher-ups pretended to be deaf. "Chichi," Tang Yu asked softly, "what's wrong?" It was only 10 o'clock. She probably hadn't had her lunch break yet. "Can you get the driver to come and pick me up?" Pei Chichi accepted that she was being unreasonable. Actually, she could have taken a taxi herself. Tang Yu smiled and said, "Okay. Sit down and wait for me." Pei Chichi had already walked to the door of the classroom, but she suddenly turned back. Actually, she didn't hear it clearly. Tang Yu said, "Wait for him, not the driver." Chen Xinru had a victorious expression at first, but when she saw Pei Chichi turn back, she was stunned. Chapter 180. Half an hour later, Tang Yu appeared at the entrance of a certain faculty's classroom in B University. Almost everyone's eyes fell on him, then turned to look at Pei Chichi. Such a noble person actually. Came to pick up Pei Chichi with just a phone call. How much did he like her for that to happen? Chen Xinjie's description of him as a sugar daddy didn't seem like it at all. Pei Chichi was sprawled on the table, drawing Tang Yu. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Tang Yu walked up a few steps to his little friend's side. He leaned over to take a look and smiled faintly. He reached out and knocked on her desk. "You're drawing this in class?" Pei Chichi looked up and pursed her lips. "I won't draw it if you don't like it." "Why wouldn't I like it?" His fingers landed on her little head and gently knocked on it. He put away the things and carried her little bag. Pei Chichi was still sprawled on the table. Tang Yu looked at her and roughly knew what she was thinking. His little friend had been spoiled by him recently. "Do you want to carry me or piggyback me?" he asked in a low voice with a hint of amusement. Honestly, he had never pampered a girl like this before. He had never even carried or piggybacked Tang Xin. Pei Chichi raised her little face, her long black hair was naturally let loose, and her little face was as beautiful as a painting. Tang Yu suddenly had the urge to cover her up and keep this beauty for himself. Pei Chichi said very softly, "I want to carry you." Didn't Chen Xinjie like to see her like this? Then she would show her high profile. How could Tang Yu not know what she was thinking? He didn't know why he allowed such a little girl's behavior, but he knew that he would do whatever she wanted him to do. Tang Yu reached out to Pei Chichi. "Don't you want to carry me?" She looked up at him for a long time before finally wrapping her arms around his neck. He picked her up easily and walked out the door. "Won't this be embarrassing?" Pei Chichi bit her lips and softly nestled in his arms. Tang Yu lowered his head and pressed his forehead against her. His voice was a little hoarse. "What's wrong, little friend?" His little friend wasn't this weak. Other than the fight with Pei Huan, he had never called for his parents. Suddenly, Tang Yu was almost happy. This joy came from her reliance on him. Pei Chichi leaned on his shoulder and said in a low voice, "They know that I'm an illegitimate child." In the past, everyone thought that she was 1 year older than Pei Huan and that her mother was Pei Ming's ex-wife. Tang Yu reached out and stroked her little head, smiling faintly. "How could our Chichi be an illegitimate child?" She looked up at him. Tang Yu smiled warmly. "If you want, you can have a mother too." Her body visibly stiffened. She was not an idiot and knew what he meant. But these were things she didn't dare to think about. She didn't dare to let those restless little flames ignite. She was afraid that once they were ignited, they wouldn't be extinguished. "Are you willing to be my mother?" She leaned into his arms and smiled lightly. In return, he patted her little butt. Naughty. She was too young, and he knew that she hadn't completely let go of it. As a proud man, Tang Yu wouldn't talk to her about it at this time. Chapter 181. He didn't come alone. Other than Meng Qingcheng, there were also a group of senior executives from Shengyuan Entertainment who came with him. More than 10 Maybachs were lined up in a row below the classroom building. Coupled with the dozens of senior executives standing there, the imposing manner was unparalleled. Meng Qingcheng felt that it was too childish for so many people to accompany the president to play a little girl's game of house. And he even left behind a development project worth billions. Pei Chichi leaned on Tang Yu's broad shoulder and secretly took a small bite. "Childish." Tang Yu sighed in his heart and smiled. "Do you like it?" Pei Chichi couldn't say it out loud. She just looked at him. In her life, Pei Ming had always played the most important role, protecting her with great difficulty. However, one day, that person was replaced by Tang Yu. A stranger who forcefully took everything away from her. He was very gentle, but she knew that deep down, he was forceful. He wouldn't allow her to betray him. He had compromised and forgiven her because those small feelings happened before they met. If it had happened after, he wouldn't have let her off so easily. But it was a man like this who helped her time and time again when she was at her most difficult. Now he asked her if she liked his childish behavior. How could she not like it? No woman would dislike this kind of doting. Pei Chichi didn't say anything and just looked at him. Tang Yu patted her and carried her into a car first. Then, he straightened his body and looked at Principal Wang, who was leading the school. He was wearing a grey suit today and looked especially dignified, like a male model who had walked out of a magazine. Principal Wang had already noticed that the second, third, fourth, and fifth floors of the classroom building were filled with students, watching. The school felt a lot of pressure, especially Principal Wang. He had just received a donation of tens of millions from Shengyuan Entertainment. It had only been a few days and Mr. Tang had come all the way here. Could it be that his little cutie was unhappy studying at B school? Principal Wang had just accompanied Qin Anlan from King Entertainment, and now Tang Yu from Shengyuan Entertainment had come. He felt that it was getting harder and harder to be the principal. Moreover, he thought that Tang Yu had appeared because he knew about King. Hence, he hurriedly explained, "We won't force student Pei to be the female lead of King Entertainment. Don't worry, Mr. Tang, King Entertainment." Tang Yu narrowed his eyes and a sharp glint flashed in his eyes. Principal Wang wanted to bite his tongue off. Mr. Tang didn't know. Tang Yu glanced at Pei Chichi in the car and pursed his lips, looking unhappy. The principal immediately understood Tang Yu's thoughts. Sure enough, men were all dark. No one would be willing to let their women show off their flirtatious side in front of outsiders. "We will deal with them." Headmaster Wang's back was already sweating, and he apologized carefully. Tang Yu snorted softly, went around to open the driver's seat, got in, and started the car. Then, the group of higher-ups also got into the car and drove away within a minute. Only the leaders of B University were left at the scene. Seeing that Principal Wang was still standing, the vice principal reached out to help him up. "Principal Wang, you have to hold on." Chapter 182. At that moment, Principal Wang was completely sober. He regained his usual composure and calmly commanded, "Now, draft up a script. Pretend to be a reporter and publish an article on the internet. We'll report what happened today and increase the exposure of our B University." He glanced around. The surveillance cameras here should be able to clearly take screenshots, right? The vice principal thought about it and felt that it was inappropriate. Won't that make Mr. Tang unhappy? Wang Xiao glanced at him. Pick something nice. Who would be unhappy? Let the professors from the Chinese department write it. Write it well. He straightened his clothes and coughed lightly. The competition between universities is fierce now. I have no choice. He then added, also, for King's casting today, just say that Mr. Tang's fiancé has been chosen. The vice principal was still a little worried. Well, isn't it a little rash to say that she's Mr. Tang's fiancé? What do you know? It's fine even if she says that she's Mr. Tang's wife. Wang Xiao snorted. When a man likes a woman, his a little ancestor. At that moment, Tang Yu was driving his little ancestor onto the highway. Pei Chichi glanced at the road sign, not daring to make a sound. You want to go? He suddenly asked. Huh? Pei Chichi was a little dazed as she turned her head to look at his handsome profile. Tang Yu coughed lightly. I mean, King, she replied with an "oh" and then shook her head. No. I don't want to go. Is it because you don't want to go, or is it because of me? He asked mildly. Pei Chichi stared at his profile, trying to discover something. But how could a young girl like her easily see through a man of Tang Yu's age? After a long while, she mumbled, because you don't like it. Do you like it then? It was rare for him to ask for an answer from her. Pei Chichi thought about it seriously. I don't like it either, but if I need money one day, I'll do it. He reached out and caressed her. That day won't come. He wouldn't let her be short of money and have to do things she didn't want to do. He gently rubbed Pei Chichi's little head. He had done this so many times that she was almost used to it. Habit is a very scary thing. She was a little dazed. On the other hand, Tang Yu's heart was somewhat gloomy. If there were any setbacks in Tang Yu's life, it would be one thing. It was about Qin Anlan, the CEO of King Entertainment. His face was a little serious, and Pei Chichi didn't dare to speak again. She only stole glances at him from time to time. Suddenly, her little hand was caught by him. Tang Yu's voice was a little deep. "Don't be afraid of me," Pei Chichi grunted and then looked ahead uncomfortably. She realized that his car was heading towards the airport. She was a little surprised. "Tang Yu, where are we going?" "A neurologist from the United States came to B City today," he said mildly, then turned to look at her. "I heard that he's very successful in treating your father's condition." Pei Chichi's little mouth was slightly open. She just stared at him, unable to speak for a long time. "Ching Cheng was supposed to pick me up, but I've already come out, so I'll take you to meet him," Tang Yu explained further. Pei Chichi lowered her head, and her voice was a little soft. "Thank you, Tang Yu." Chapter 183. "Oh," Pei Chichi said again. He sighed again. "Pei Chichi, I'm here." She looked at him and pursed her lips. "You don't have to repeat yourself like that. Like an old man." Tang Yu glanced at her. Pei Chichi immediately fell silent. She must have been emboldened just now. He patted her little hand and let go. Then, he focused on driving. When they arrived at the airport, they waited in the VIP lounge for about half an hour before Mr. Elon came out from a special passage, followed by a young assistant. Tang Yu gave a brief introduction and chatted with Dr. Elon as they walked, speaking in English the entire time. Pei Chichi's English wasn't bad, but she was surprised that he spoke a lot of professional English, and she couldn't quite understand it at all. Moreover, he looked really noble and elegant. He was more restrained than usual and appeared much more modest. For some reason, Pei Chichi's heart palpitated. Because she understood that he was doing all this for her. Suddenly, Dr. Elon said in Mandarin, "Tang, your girlfriend is very beautiful." Tang Yu glanced at Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi was a little embarrassed. After a moment, Mr. Tang said very calmly, "She's passable, but she's too young." Dr. Elon smiled at Pei Chichi and said, "Tang likes you very much." Pei Chichi could only smile faintly. Then, her little hand tugged at Tang Yu's sleeve and refused to let go. She was always a little embarrassed. She wasn't used to it. Tang Yu simply grabbed her little hand and held it. When they got into his car, he arranged for Dr. Elon and his assistant to sit in the back, and then he reminded Pei Chichi, "Inform your family that we're going now." Pei Chichi almost forgot. She took out her phone and dialed home. Ju Mailin picked up the phone. Hearing Pei Chichi's voice, she seemed particularly cold. "What's the matter?" She hated Pei Chichi even more than before. On the day of Pei Huan's wedding, the wedding was ruined because of Pei Chichi's disappearance. Pei Huan had no face at all. Everyone in the Lin family knew that Lin Jinrong liked Pei Chichi and didn't care about Pei Huan at all. If not for the piece of meat in his belly, Lin Jinrong probably wouldn't admit it. These days, Pei Huan returned to her parents' home, and Lin Jinrong did not come to see her even once. Even Ju Meilin's heart inevitably turned cold, but because of the Lin family's power, she did not dare to say anything. Now that Pei Chichi called, how could she be comfortable? Pei Chichi pursed her lips. Tang Yu invited an American doctor over to take a look at Dad. When Ju Mailin heard this, she calmed down. From the bottom of her heart, she still hoped that Pei Ming could get better. Now that Pei Huan was being bullied in her in-laws' home, and there was no man at home, she always felt that she was lacking in confidence, and she had no one to rely on. The main reason was that the pretty boy, Rong Lei, had run away, so Ju Meilin's thoughts also came back a little. "Then come over. Your father has just woken up." Ju Mailin softened her tone. Just as she hung up the phone, she saw Pei Huan coming down the stairs with her belly in her hands. "Mom, it's that bitch, Pei Chichi. She came back just in time. I'm going to tear her apart." Pei Huan's face was full of hatred. Her life was ruined by Pei Chichi. If it wasn't for Pei Chichi's appearance, she would have lived a peaceful life with Lin Jinrong. It was all Pei Chichi's fault. She had stolen her father when she was young, and now she wanted to steal Jinrong. Chapter 184. Pei Huan glared at Zhu Meilin indignantly and went upstairs angrily. Zhu Meilin sighed. This child had been spoiled rotten by her. Even though she was a little annoyed, she still called out worriedly, "Don't come down later, lest you lose your cool." Pei Huan didn't say anything and went upstairs. Zhu Meilin waited anxiously. Although she was mean, she was an old woman after all, and she still knew, especially since Lin Jinrong was obviously unreliable. Just based on his attitude towards Pei Huan, her heart was cold enough. Zhu Meilin knew very well that Lin Jinrong gave the 20 million yuan last time to Pei Chichi because he felt sorry for that little bitch. Zhu Meilin watched coldly from the sidelines. Pei Chichi might really be the phoenix that flew up the branches. She didn't dare to do anything to Pei Chichi anymore. No matter what, Tang Yu wasn't someone she could provoke, and now she hoped to use Tang Yu to get through this difficult time. Most importantly, if Pei Chichi really got together with Tang Yu, with a status, Lin Jinrong would give up. Why would he still have any tricks up his sleeve? An hour later, Tang Yu's car slowly drove into Pei Ming's villa. He got out of the car first and opened the door for Dr. Elon. Although Dr. Elon was very polite and courteous, Pei Chichi's heart was a little throbbing. A person like Tang Yu might have never begged anyone before, let alone opened a car door for someone else. Zhu Meilin stood at the door, very polite and considerate. She was the most gentle side of Pei Chichi she had ever seen. She followed behind Tang Yu and Dr. Elon into Pei Ming's bedroom. It was very clean and bright, and it was taken good care of. Pei Chichi's heart was relieved. She leaned against Tang Yu and watched Dr. Elon examine Pei Ming. She was a little nervous, and her palms were sweaty. Suddenly, Tang Yu caught her little hand and held it in his palm. His palm was exceptionally warm and dry, strangely soothing her uneasiness. Dr. Yilan's Chinese was not bad, so she asked Pei Ming a few questions. Although it was difficult for Pei Ming, he could still answer. When he didn't say anything, his gaze fell on Pei Chichi's face and Tang Yu's. His eyes were clearly asking, "Who is this?" Pei Chichi felt a little guilty. She whispered in Pei Ming's ear, "This is a relative of the Lin family." In front of Tang Yu, she still did not dare to say Lin Jinrong's name. Pei Ming stared at Tang Yu for a long time. Tang Yu secretly held Pei Chichi's hand and then let go. A relative of the Lin family? Really? Dr. Elon's examination was very detailed. After about 10 minutes, he straightened his body and looked at Tang Yu. "Tang, if you insist on long-term rehabilitation, using the opposite method, you'll probably be able to stand up again after 2 years." Tang Yu smiled. "Thank you." Even Zhu Meilin was more or less happy. As a woman, she didn't have the courage to leave Pei Ming, and she didn't want to stay with a crippled husband, so she always hoped that he could get better. She looked at the white-haired and fair-skinned Dr. Elon and wanted to thank him, but she felt that it was strange to speak in Chinese, so she pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Zhu Meilin had never felt so unsophisticated. Fortunately, Tang Yu was very attentive to Dr. Elon. After the examination, Dr. Elon left some information. It was medicine suitable for Pei Ming to take, and some massage methods. Chapter 185. Zhu Meilin watched as Tang Yu casually dealt with the foreigners, not losing any of his elegance. Zhu Meilin sighed in her heart, thinking that Pei Chichi had gotten a great bargain. After the inspection, Tang Yu left with his men, and Zhu Meilin didn't even get a chance to say anything. Pei Chichi wanted to stay, but she also knew that with Pei Huan at home, and with Zhu Meilin, Tang Yu stood by the car and said, "Chichi, let's go." "Oh," Pei Chichi replied and walked over. He held the car door for her to get in, then closed the door for her, went around to the other side and sat down to start the car. "Doctor, after dinner, do you want to go shopping or go back to the hotel to rest?" Tang Yu raised his hand to look at the time. Dr. Elon seemed to be in high spirits. "Tang, I'm not tired. Let's go shopping, and bring your cute little girlfriend with us." Tang Yu smiled, reached out to rub Pei Chichi's long hair, and started the car. Dr. Elon was surprisingly childlike, playing with things that children like to play with, such as video games, sports car simulators, and so on. Pei Chichi had never played with such things before. What shocked her was that Tang Yu actually took off his jacket, threw it into her arms, and then got on the small motorcycle. His legs were really a killer, slender and strong to the point that it made people's hair stand on end. Pei Chichi also keenly noticed that there were many girls around staring at Tang Yu, and many of them were sexy. "What are you looking at?" Tang Yu reached out to her. "Where's the money?" Pei Chichi gave him the money. Tang Yu was on the motorcycle, and it took him about half an hour to kill. "You used to play it often?" Tang Yu raised an eyebrow. "My first time." Pei Chichi bit her seductive lips. "You played it so well on your first time." She had only been there for a minute, and she had already died. Tang Yu took the jacket from her hand and placed it on his arm. He looked at Professor Elon and chuckled. "Didn't we have a good time the first time?" The first time, Pei Chichi understood what he meant, and her face turned a little red. Tang Yu chuckled and reached out to stroke her hair. "Chichi, was it an accident? What was there to be surprised about?" It was his first time too. But later, when they did it again, he was very skilled. Really, he didn't seem like a newbie. Pei Chichi bit her lips and did not answer him. Then, she snatched his jacket childishly and buried her warm little face in his jacket. Tang Yu smiled faintly and followed behind her. After accompanying Professor Elon for the whole afternoon, they finally had some alone time. Tang Yu drove and looked at the little girl beside him. "Where do you want to go?" Pei Chichi looked at the lights outside and turned to look at him. "Tang Yu, let's go watch a movie, okay?" He seemed to be thinking about it. "Pei Chichi, you skipped class for the whole day, and now you want to watch a movie? Don't you need to do your homework?" As he said that, he wrapped his arms around her. "Call me brother and I'll take you there. I'm not Tang Xin." Pei Chichi's body was covered with his jacket. She sniffed it and could smell the faint scent of a man's cologne. It was very refreshing. Tang Yu only smiled and retracted his arms. "But you're more like a child than Tang Xin now." Pei Chichi grunted and looked up. "I should have asked Tang Xin to come. She would be very happy." Chapter 186. It happened to be a red light. He stopped the car and looked at her. At this moment, there was a neon glow in her eyes, making them look even more dazzling. "Chichi." He called her softly, then lowered his head and kissed her eyelids. She naturally lowered her eyes and allowed him to kiss her lightly. Her slender body trembled slightly. After the kiss, Tang Yu looked at her and smiled. "Call her next time." The car behind them honked and the green light turned green. Tang Yu continued driving, turned a corner and took her to a restaurant. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "Let's eat first, then go watch a movie." "Oh," Pei Chichi replied and looked at him. "Are you really taking me to watch a movie?" Tang Yu couldn't help laughing. "What do you think?" He held her little hand and led her into the restaurant. The manager personally went up to them. "Mr. Tang." Tang Yu nodded lightly. The manager led them to a seat by the window. "Mr. Tang, are you satisfied with this seat?" Tang Yu nodded. "Let's do this." Pei Chichi sat face to face with him. The waiter first brought 2 glasses of aperitif and a dessert. Tang Yu held the wine glass with his slender fingers and took a sip. When he put it down, he saw that Pei Chichi's eyes were fixed on him. He smiled. "What are you looking at?" Pei Chichi pursed her lips. "Tang Yu, is it good?" "This." He picked up the aperitif again. "It's not very suitable for children." Pei Chichi looked at her own glass, and there was a hint of desire in her eyes. Tang Yu sighed softly. "This child wants to grow up. You can have a sip," he said helplessly. Pei Chichi raised her eyes and looked at him. Then, she carefully picked up the cup of golden liquid and took a small sip. It was especially spicy. Why do these men think that having a drink before a meal is high class? In such a high-class restaurant, she naturally couldn't lose her composure. Pei Chichi's little face was bitter, but she could only endure it. Tang Yu pushed the dessert in front of her and smiled silently. "Eat something sweet to suppress it." Pei Chichi's eyes were filled with tears. Disobedient little girl. Tang Yu stood up and walked to her side, leaning slightly to let her lean into his arms. He knew that in a restaurant like this, and with his status, it was a little too much. However, he still wanted to spoil her like this. At this moment, a surprised voice sounded. "Tang Yu." Pei Chichi felt that the voice was both strange and familiar. When she poked her head out of his arms, she saw Qin Anlan from King Entertainment. Standing next to him was a woman with a special temperament. She was wearing a beige knitted top and a long skirt. She had long wavy hair, and when she stood next to Qin Anlan, they looked like a good match. At this moment, the woman's gaze was on Tang Yu's face. That gaze was very complicated. Pei Chichi subconsciously looked at Tang Yu. Tang Yu patted her with his fingers, then let go. Standing up straight, he said in a slightly indifferent tone, "Anlan." Qin Anlan glanced at the female companion beside him. "Shun Lian returned to Bi City a few days ago, and I specially welcomed her. Why don't we eat together?" As he said that, he looked at Pei Chichi with a faint smile in his eyes. "Your little female companion doesn't mind, right?" Pei Chichi was in no position to answer. Actually, it depended on whether Tang Yu minded or not. Chapter 187. Actually, it depended on whether Tang Yu minded, but Tang Yu said nonchalantly, "Let's go together then." From the beginning to the end, Tang Yu did not pay much attention to Shun Lian, who was sitting beside Qin Anlan. However, Pei Chichi could feel that he was doing it on purpose. Tang Yu grabbed her little hand and sat her down next to him. She stole a glance at him. Qin Anlan smiled and said, "I really couldn't tell." Tang Yu did not explain. He only called the waiter over and ordered for an extra order. Qin Anlan held the menu and asked Shun Lian politely, "What would you like to eat?" Shun Lian supported her chin with one hand and drew circles on the table with the other. "Let Tang Yu order for me. He knows what I like to eat." She then looked up at Pei Chichi and said, "You don't mind, right?" If Pei Chichi still could not tell that this beautiful woman had something going on with Tang Yu, she would be too silly. She looked at Tang Yu and smiled. "You have to ask Tang Yu about this." Shun Lian looked at Tang Yu again. "It's fine as long as Anlan decides." Tang Yu pushed it away without a trace. Shun Lian's gaze was a little complicated, but she did not flare up. She leaned back in her chair and looked at him calmly. "Tang Yu, is this your little girlfriend?" She didn't even put Pei Chichi in her eyes. Tang Yu smiled and said, "She's not really my girlfriend." He then paused and continued, "She's someone I like. She'll probably be my child's mother in the future." Shun Lian's expression changed when she heard that. Meanwhile, Pei Chichi only felt her heart palpitate. He had talked about getting married a few times before, but this was the first time he had said it in front of others, and it was even possible, in front of his ex-girlfriend. She didn't think it was a joke at all. Pei Chichi had a feeling that she could no longer escape. In her heart, there was a voice telling her, "Pei Chichi, if you don't escape now, you won't be able to escape." But she didn't want to escape at all. Something had broken out of the cocoon. Something was telling her why she was here, accepting the provocation of this woman named Shun Lian. And why would she care about Tang Yu's reaction? Qin Anlan smiled. "Congratulations. Chichi is still in school," Tang Yu said briefly, not intending to say too much. But this also showed his attitude. He was serious about Pei Chichi. Later on, the meal was not very pleasant. At first, Pei Chichi thought that she was the only one who was unhappy. After all, she was too far away from their circle. But now, she realized that she was the happiest one. Tang Yu didn't have much of an expression, neither did Qin Anlan. Needless to say, Shun Lian didn't look interested. Pei Chichi had to admit that Shun Lian was a very beautiful woman, very fashionable and exquisite. She was different from a young girl like her. Women's intuition was very accurate. As Pei Chichi looked at them, Tang Yu glanced at her indifferently, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to the washroom." Pei Chichi felt that they might have something to say if she was here, so she said softly. The corner of Tang Yu's mouth twitched slightly, which was a sign of agreement. When Pei Chichi stood up, he naturally helped her with the back of his hand. Pei Chichi lowered her head and smiled lightly. Chapter 188. Shun Lian's gaze landed on his hand, and she was a little stunned. Pei Chichi walked out of the washroom and saw Qin Anlan when she came out. He was wearing a black shirt and casual pants of the same color. He was leaning against the wall, and his gaze was unreadable. Pei Chichi glanced at him and didn't say anything. She just walked over to wash her hands. They used to be lovers. Qin Anlan sounded a little lazy. Pei Chichi lowered her head. Used to be. That wasn't the point, all right? Qin Anlan smiled. You don't mind? Pei Chichi looked up at Qin Anlan in the mirror. It wasn't surprising that he knew Tang Yu, because of their status. What about you? Pei Chichi's lips curved. Do you mind? Tang Yu and her? Qin Anlan narrowed his eyes, and there was a look of embarrassment in his eyes. He had never been forced into such a state before. Although it was just a simple sentence, it hit him right in the heart. How did you know? Qin Anlan straightened his body and stood behind her, giving Pei Chichi a sense of oppression. Pei Chichi didn't move. She was still looking at him in the mirror. She had only met this man twice, but her instincts told her that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. If Tang Yu was said to be cold and arrogant, then the man in front of him would definitely have one more adjective, sinister. Qin Anlan leaned forward slightly, as if he was covering her body with his. His warm masculinity enveloped her, and his lips were close to her ear. Pei Chichi, why don't you be my female lead? She understood what he meant. He wanted to replace Tang Yu and provide for her. Mr. Qin, don't you think you've sacrificed too much? Pei Chichi turned around. Does she appreciate it? With that, Pei Chichi gently pushed him away and walked to the other side of the aisle. Qin Anlan stood there quietly with one hand in his pocket. There was no expression on his face. Was it worth it? He had once asked himself, was it worth it for a woman who had never loved him? She had treated him excessively and even treated him as a substitute. Tang Yu didn't touch her, so she drank some wine and went to sleep with him. She kissed him in front of Tang Yu in an attempt to provoke Tang Yu's anger, but it didn't work. Later, they broke up because Tang Yu did not touch women, and because she slept with Qin Anlan. How could such a noble Tang Yu still want her? Pei Chichi returned to her seat. The atmosphere was a little strange. When Tang Yu saw her, he said calmly, "It's about time. I'll leave with Chichi first." He waved to the waiter. "Put it on my tab." Pei Chichi stuck out her tongue. "They're done catching up so soon." Tang Yu picked up her bag and coat. He didn't look out of place at all. At this time, Qin Anlan also came down and looked at Tang Yu. "You're leaving now? I wanted to buy you a drink." "No, Chichi has school tomorrow." Tang Yu reached out to comb Pei Chichi's long hair gently and smiled. He held his things in one hand and Pei Chichi's hand in the other as they walked out. Shun Lian looked at him and suddenly said, "Tang Yu, how did you find her?" She knew that he couldn't touch her in the past. He had experimented with many women, but none of them worked. She didn't believe that they would be together even if they couldn't have sex. Chapter 189. He looked at Shun Lian quietly, his eyes emotionless. "She was the one who found me." With that said, he pulled Pei Chichi into his arms and carried her towards the door. There was no reluctance. "Tang Yu." Shun Lian stood there, calling his name and murmuring. Qin Anlan stood by the side with a playful look on his face. After a while, he said softly, "He won't turn back." "Shun Lian, it's not the first day you've met him. Just because I can't satisfy him?" Shun Lian's gaze was a little blurred. She and Tang Yu had grown up together, and they were a golden couple in the eyes of others. However, he couldn't touch her. They had tested each other's bodies several times. She had silently endured him going to find someone else to test it on. She had pretended that she didn't know, because she wanted him to be normal. A few years was enough to make a woman give up. Later on, she slept with Qin Anlan, on Tang Yu's bed. They broke up, and what made Shun Lian feel the most was that Tang Yu acted as though nothing had happened. "Anlan, do you think he has ever loved me?" Shun Lian smiled bitterly and looked up at Qin Anlan. She had actually lost to a little girl. Qin Anlan pursed his thin lips. If a woman was possessed by a man, it would be unforgettable. Similarly, if a man didn't get a woman, he wouldn't be able to talk about reminiscing. He didn't answer Shun Lian, because he couldn't answer. Maybe he had loved her, maybe he hadn't, but the only thing he was sure of was that he didn't love her anymore. Pei Chichi sat beside Tang Yu. He was still driving with one hand and holding her hand with the other. Her heart was beating a little fast. She looked at him sideways and said softly, "Tang Yu, let go of me." Her little hand struggled helplessly. Tang Yu looked at her and smiled. He didn't make things difficult for her and let go. His eyes were looking forward, but he said to her, "Why not?" "Ah." She seemed to be in a trance, but her reply was too quick and deliberate. Tang Yu laughed hoarsely, coughed lightly, and said seriously, "Shen Lian is my ex-girlfriend. We grew up together, and so is Anlan. We dated for about 2 years, then we broke up." Pei Chichi just looked at him, not quite believing that he would talk to her about this. "What? Do you mind?" He suddenly turned his head to look at her, his eyes smiling. This was the 3rd time he had asked her if she minded. Pei Chichi mustered up her courage. "Do you want me to mind?" He grunted in acknowledgement. That sound was extremely faint, and also quite arrogant. Pei Chichi's heart was beating a little fast, but she maintained a calm expression. "Then I don't mind." "Oh." Tang Yu smiled again. His slender fingers skillfully turned the steering wheel and reversed the car into the parking lot of the cinema. When the car stopped, she realized that they weren't in Xia City. She had almost forgotten about the movie. And at this moment, he didn't seem to want to let her go. The car stopped. She wanted to get out, but she heard a subtle sound. The car door was locked. Pei Chichi turned her head to look at him, a little surprised. Tang Yu slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and sat in the dark car, looking at her eyes. His eyes looked especially clear in the dark. Pei Chichi's heart beat faster again. Chapter 190. You don't mind? Tang Yu suddenly leaned close to her and pressed his entire body against hers. Pei Chichi struggled a little, but she couldn't break free. He looked down at her, and one of his hands suddenly caressed her delicate little face. "You don't mind kissing her like this?" With that said, he leaned forward and kissed her little mouth. Pei Chichi's eyes widened. She could only feel that he was leaning so close to her. He was so close that she had nowhere to escape. She could only look at him helplessly. His breath stained hers domineeringly. After a long while, he looked up and caressed her slightly red and swollen little mouth. "You don't mind doing this either?" Pei Chichi bit her lower lip and turned her little face to the side uncomfortably. Tang Yu gently turned her face over. His expression was a little serious. "Chichi, I can't say that there's no past, but I promise that it won't happen again in the future." What he said couldn't be clearer, and he was looking at her, waiting for her response. Pei Chichi's body trembled slightly as she looked at him. To her, Tang Yu was so good, so good. Could she really, really? Zhao Ku's face kept swaying in front of her eyes. Pei Chichi felt a sense of guilt in her heart. There was also a kind of fear. One day, he would find out that she was Zhao Ku's daughter. If she didn't fall in love with him, the only thing he could hurt her with was his body. But if she fell in love with him, she didn't dare to think about what would happen to her. Pei Chichi admitted that she was a coward, but Tang Yu continued to tempt her like this. He was like a village drug, luring her to come closer and closer. His kindness gave her something to rely on. Before she could be absolutely strong, he was the one who gave her a warm harbor. Pei Chichi's eyes were watery, and she looked lovely. Forget it. Tang Yu suddenly sighed and covered her eyes. He didn't force her anymore. After calming down for a while, he sat up straight and unlocked the car. Pei Chichi was still a little uneasy. She looked at him from time to time while watching the movie. Of course, there were other girls peeking at him. Tang Yu simply carried her over and placed her on his knees, pressing her against his chest. It was soft and soft, like a small animal in his arms. Tang Yu could caress Mo from time to time. It felt good. As for what they watched, Mr. Tang didn't think it was important. What was important was that he and Pei Chichi had completed such an important thing, a date. She was like a little mouse nestling in his arms eating popcorn. It was such a big portion, but she actually ate it all. Only then did Tang Yu realize that Pei Chichi could eat so much. At the end of the movie, Pei Chichi followed him and explained the plot. Tang Yu did not understand at all because he did not watch the movie. However, he listened to her patiently. After playing the dating game that kids liked with her, They were going to play the game that adult men liked at night. When they got into the car, Pei Chichi buckled her seatbelt and suddenly put her little hand on his arm. She bit her lips and said softly, "Tang you. Millimeter?" He turned his head to look at her. "Thank you." She was talking about Dr. Elan. Originally, she felt like there was something weighing on her heart. Now that Pei Ming had a chance to recover, it was the best news for her. Tang Yu smiled and didn't say anything. Chapter 191. At this moment, she was satisfied and tired. It was as if she didn't care where he drove. "Tired?" Tang Yu asked softly. His voice sounded especially hoarse in the dark night. Pei Chichi nodded and took the initiative to stick her little face on the arm by his side. Tang Yu glanced at her distractedly and patted her little head. "You can sleep when we get back. If you sleep now, you'll catch a cold when we get off the car," she replied obediently with her eyes half closed. As he drove, he chatted with her from time to time. Pei Chichi pursed her lips and nodded her head. The car didn't go back to Xia City. Instead, it went to a top hotel under Shengyuan. GM. It was the hotel where Lin Jinrong and Pei Huan got engaged. Tang Yu unbuckled his seatbelt. He sighed when he saw that she was almost asleep. He went around to open the car door and carefully carried her out of the car. Pei Chichi woke up. She looked at the luxurious hotel lobby and felt a little uneasy. She nestled in his arms. "Where are we?" "We'll stay in the hotel tonight." He comforted her. Pei Chichi pursed her lips and buried her face in his arms. Tang Yu laughed. "I just have a breakfast meeting here tomorrow." "Pei Chichi, are you thinking too much?" She buried her face a little deeper into the pillow. Tang Yu smiled. When he carried her to the elevator, he put her down and let her rest in his arms. But how could he not do something on a night like this? When the elevator door opened, he half carried her into the room. Tang Yu put his bag at the entrance and carried her to the bedroom like he was carrying a child. He kissed her and asked, "Do you want to come first or take a shower?" She knew it. Pei Chichi lay on his shoulder and bit his shoulder angrily. She could feel his muscles bulging. He patted her. "Chichi, I knew you'd been thinking about this." She clenched her small fists and punched his shoulder. Then, his body was pressed against the wall, and he still did not make it to the bathroom. Pei Chichi was afraid of falling, so she could only hug his neck tightly. And he was currently pressing against her body in an outrageous manner. "Is that so? Chichi, do you want to check it for me?" He grabbed her little hand and led her. Pei Chichi closed her eyes and screamed, "No." But he still succeeded. He laughed happily, as if teasing her was the happiest thing in the world. Pei Chichi moaned softly and lay on his shoulder, looking especially obedient. Tang Yu's heart softened. He kissed her, his voice hoarse. "Chichi." He held her little face in his hands and looked at her intently, as if he was looking into her soul. Trembling, she offered her lips to him for a kiss. When it was over, Tang Yu was extremely satisfied. He patted her back and felt that her fragile look was especially cute. Men are all beast. Especially when she trembled when she was aroused, she looked like some kind of small animal. At this moment, she was like a small animal in his arms, and her back was covered with a thin layer of sweat. "Do you want to take a shower?" He lowered his head and asked her. Pei Chichi shook her head and hugged him tightly. Now, she just wanted to hug him and just hug him like this. Pei Huan felt that Pei Chichi had become even more beautiful. She was already so beautiful that she was jealous of her beauty and wanted to ruin her face. Now, she was even more beautiful. That was the kind of beauty that could only be found after a long period of love. Chapter 192. Pei Huan stood on the stairs and watched as Pei Chichi and Pei Ming talked. Pei Ming was sitting in a wheelchair. Although he couldn't move, he was smiling. Now, the only person who could make Pei Ming smile was Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi had snatched her father and Lin Jinrong away. Now, even her mother was siding with her. Wasn't Pei Chichi relying on Tang Yu's favor? Pei Huan raised her head. Her eyes were cold as she walked down slowly. "Pei Chichi, why are you so kind today to visit Dad? Aren't you?" She seemed to have thought of something and didn't say it out loud. Pei Chichi smiled faintly. "You said it yourself. It's my dad." She squatted down and continued to feed Pei Ming the apple as she spoke. She carefully scraped the apple to make sure that Pei Ming didn't need to use much strength to eat it. Pei Chichi had told Tang Yu that she wouldn't be going to her internship every day. She would come straight here after school and wait for him to get off work. Because Tang Yu came over every day, Zhu Meilin didn't dare to let Pei Chichi down. At most, Pei Huan would make a few sarcastic remarks. Therefore, Pei Chichi felt that she was using Tang Yu's power to intimidate others. She was like a little fox hiding behind Tang Yu. Pei Ming couldn't move, but his mind was still clear. He shook his head when he heard Pei Huan's words. Pei Chichi pressed him lightly. "Dad, it's not like you don't know that Pei Huan and I have been arguing all the time. It's nothing. Moreover, she's pregnant now. I'll give in to her." She coaxed Pei Ming as if he were a child. Pei Ming shook his head again and finally calmed down. Pei Huan only looked at him coldly. Pei Chichi continued to dig the apple and comforted him gently. Mr. Pei Ming will be able to stand up again soon. Dad, when you're better, let's go for a walk in the park. You said before that what you want the most is to not be so busy and spend more time with your family." Pei Chichi helped him pull the blanket. "Auntie and Pei Huan will go too. Pei Chichi, don't flatter yourself." Pei Huan walked out without looking at them again. She could not stand Pei Chichi's filial piety. He was clearly her father, and Pei Chichi was not legitimate. Why did she act like a wild child? Pei Chichi looked at Pei Ming's disappointed eyes and patted the back of his hand. "Pei Huan is pregnant. Pregnant women are usually emotionally unstable, just like Auntie back then, am I right?" Pei Ming seemed to have thought of something, and he actually smiled slightly. Although his face was a little crooked, he still smiled. Pei Chichi accompanied him for a while. Seeing that it was getting late, she pushed Pei Ming back to the bedroom and helped him lie on the bed with the caretaker. When she was around, Zhu Meilin usually avoided her. When she left, she forced a smile and greeted her. It was not that Pei Chichi did not hate her, but her father needed someone to take care of him. After all, she, Pei Chichi, was still an outsider. When she left, Zhu Meilin followed her, looking a little unnatural. "Auntie, what's the matter?" Pei Chichi asked lightly. Zhu Meilin wiped her tears. "Chichi, I'm so happy to hear you call me auntie. I'm sorry for what happened in the past. Fortunately, you found Mr. Tang, and he's really good to you. Auntie really wants to make it up to you." Chapter 193. Zhu Meilin felt embarrassed when she said it directly. She hesitated and said, "Chichi, I don't have anything else. It's just that Huan Huan has been staying at home for many days, and Jinrong hasn't come to pick her up." Before she could finish, Pei Chichi interrupted her. "Auntie, don't tell me you want me to persuade Lin Jinrong." "Of course not." Zhu Meilin reached out to hold her hand, but Pei Chichi gently pulled her hand away. Zhu Meilin was a little upset, but she did not flare up. She coughed lightly. "Of course I won't make things difficult for you. It's just that Mr. Tang is Jinrong's closest relative. Jinrong will always listen to him." Pei Chichi looked down and suddenly smiled. Then she looked up at Zhu Meilin. "Auntie, do you think love can be forced? It's like if you don't like me, one day, you will suddenly find me cute and like me from the bottom of your heart." Zhu Meilin was stunned for a moment, and then her face turned a little red. She knew very well how she treated Pei Chichi. Now, she was just thick-skinned enough to beg. She still wanted to say something, but Pei Chichi continued to say coldly, "Auntie, I know best what you have done to me and to my father. I call you auntie because of my father." Zhu Meilin could not help but say, "Pei Chichi, if it weren't for me, you wouldn't have met Mr. Tang. Then I should thank you, auntie." Pei Chichi said softly, "If there's a chance, I will definitely repay you." This sentence made Zhu Meilin's hair stand on end. She had never dared to look down on Pei Chichi. Now it seemed that she was really a wolf in sheep's clothing. Zhu Meilin did not gain any benefits, but was instead attacked by this wicked girl. She was so angry that her neck turned red, but she could only endure it. She gritted her teeth and said, "I will wait." Pei Chichi walked out and saw Pei Huan. Pei Huan's child was only 2 months old, and she was so thin that it was not obvious at all. However, she seemed to be showing off as she held her belly. She looked at Pei Chichi with a fierce look in her eyes. They were both 20 years old, but Pei Chichi was much younger than her. At this time, Pei Chichi was wearing her school uniform, a white silk blouse and a black pleated skirt, with a trench coat of the same color on the outside. Pei Huan had done some research on fashion magazines, so she recognized that it was a brand's latest trench coat, which cost about 56,000 yuan. As for herself, she was wearing pajamas and an ordinary white knitted sweater. Her complexion was not as beautiful as before. Pei Huan was the one who had married into a rich family. But why was it that Pei Chichi was living so well? Pei Huan looked at Pei Chichi and said coldly, "Don't be complacent so soon. I don't think I have anything to be proud of." Pei Chichi walked forward and suddenly stopped. "Pei Huan, you always think that I have taken something from you, but I have never taken anything from you. What is yours is still yours. You have no idea that what you have is something that I can never have in this lifetime." Pei Huan was a legitimate child. Even though Zhu Meilin was a selfish mother, she gave all her motherly love to Pei Huan. Chapter 194. Later on, when she slept, she would always pull the blanket over herself and turn the lights to the dimmest setting. That was because she knew that if she didn't turn off the lights, Zhu Meilin would come in and turn them off. She tried her best to look adorable as she slept soundly. She felt that she was cuter than Pei Huan. But even so, the auntie did not kiss her even after turning off the lights. Sometimes, she would stand by the bed and look at her for a while, muttering to herself, "You look exactly like that bitch." When Pei Chichi first heard that, she did not know what a bitch was. But later on, she knew. Her face grew colder and colder as she gradually stopped smiling and stopped leaving the lights on for Zhu Meilin to turn off. That was because she knew that Zhu Meilin would never call her sweetheart for the rest of her life. Pei Huan laughed coldly. "Is that so?" She looked at Pei Chichi with narrowed eyes and said wickedly, "Pei Chichi, I thought you were a sentimental person. Turns out that's all." Pei Chichi ignored her as Pei Huan leaned closer and whispered, "Do you dare to say that you're not in love with Tang Yu? It has nothing to do with you." Pei Chichi walked out. Pei Huan said that she was in love with Tang Yu, but she did not know it herself. After waiting outside for a while, Tang Yu's car drove over slowly. Tang Yu rolled down the window and said quickly, "Get in." Pei Chichi sat in the car and did not say anything for a long time. Tang Yu asked while driving, "What's wrong?" Pei Chichi looked at him and hesitated for a while. "Zhu Meilin told me about Pei Huan and Lin Jinrong." The moment she said that, the sports car drifted on the road. Tang Yu snorted, "You want me to interfere?" His IQ was really, "No. I did not agree to it." Pei Chichi sighed, "Why would I?" After a while, Tang Yu suddenly said, "Chichi, I want them to reconcile more than you do." His words were very meaningful. Pei Chichi thought for a moment and understood. But she didn't say anything else. If she did, she would fall into his trap again. Tang Yu tilted his head to look at her. She had already taken off her trench coat in the car, revealing her university uniform underneath. This was the first time he had seen her wear. She was very pretty and appeared very pure. Especially since her hair was tied up like a princess's hairstyle today, her neck was as smooth as cream. Tang Yu admitted that he was a little restless. He didn't drive properly and glanced at her from time to time. Pei Chichi was just thinking about her own matters. She bit her little finger and leaned her head against the seat. The car stopped, and Tang Yu's voice was a little hoarse. "Get out." Only then did Pei Chichi realize that they had arrived at the apartment in Xia City. Mr. Tang restrained himself from doing her in the car and opened the door to get out of the car with her. He held her in one arm and held his briefcase in the other. He still restrained himself from kissing her in the elevator. When they arrived home, he put the things in his hands aside and pressed her against the door to kiss her. His body was tightly pressed against hers, and she could feel his urgency. He held her little face with his big palm and kissed her gently, but his hands were not very gentle. They could even be considered rough. Pei Chichi couldn't break free. She could only look up and remind him with difficulty, "You haven't eaten yet." His lips were on her little neck, and he bit her. He chuckled and said, "I'll eat you now." She remembered that he wanted her behind the door last time, and her body trembled a little. Chapter 195. Tang Yu's heart fluttered. He lowered his head and kissed her. Just as he was about to carry her back to the bedroom, Auntie Lee came out of the kitchen and looked at them in surprise. These two little ones. Were they going to do that kind of thing just by the door? Auntie Lee's old face was very agitated. She held the plate and didn't know what to do. After a while, she coughed lightly and said, "Mr. Tang, dinner is ready. I'll go back first." Tang Yu's body froze for a while. He looked down at the girl in his arms. Her face was extremely red as she leaned on his shoulder. He patted her, straightened his body, and turned his head. "Okay. Be careful on the way back." Auntie Lee felt that Mr. Tang was unbelievably gentle today. She put the plate on the dining table and untied her apron. When she left, she almost forgot about her bag. That old face was so agitated. So agitated. Tang Yu let go of Pei Chichi and walked to the dining table calmly. Pei Chichi said goodbye to Auntie Lee. She closed the door and walked over to scoop some rice for him. He had been very nice to her these days, but their interaction was still the same as before. She was still doing most of the housework. Tang Yu didn't talk much during the meal. After the meal, he only said lightly, "Wash the dishes and make a cup of coffee, then come to my study." Pei Chichi grunted in acknowledgement and stole another glance at him. She was relieved that he didn't bring up the previous incident again. But she was still too naive. Tang Yu was a serious man and also an old-fashioned man. He looked very chaste. However, he was still a man. He wouldn't be without the bad habits that men had. Pei Chichi made the coffee and opened the study. He was sitting, and the laptop in front of him wasn't turned on. She carefully placed the coffee in front of him. Tang Yu looked up and said, "Come here." Pei Chichi stood still and didn't move. He stretched out his long arm and dragged her over. He didn't carry her into his arms, but directly sat on the study table. He remained seated, admiring her helplessness. The uniform on her looked especially seductive. Tang Yu had never thought of himself as a perverted man, but now he felt that he was. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he stared at her neckline. "Take off your shirt." Pei Chichi bit her lips and said in a trembling voice, "Tang Yu." She looked up at him helplessly, then tried to hug him, but he moved away. "Not here. Because it would be a disgrace to etiquette." This was the study. Tang Yu coaxed her. "Chichi, be good." He finally stood up. With one hand on her waist, he kissed her. He wanted to do it in the most sacred place. When it was over, he could no longer look at his desk. His laptop fell to the ground. Pei Chichi was still trembling in his arms. Tang Yu looked up at her. Her little shoulder was imprinted with his mark, like a little beast. Her long hair was scattered hopelessly, entangling them. His big hand slowly straightened her hair, and his lips were close to her ear. "Does it hurt?" Pei Chichi turned her face away and ignored him. Tang Yu's heart was infinitely satisfied. He didn't argue with the little girl, so he carried her to the bathroom attached to the study. He was really shameless tonight. He wouldn't let go of her. Chapter 196. Pei Chichi swore that she would never wear that set of clothes again. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, after spending time with Pei Ming, Pei Chichi received a call from Tang Yu. He had a meeting and couldn't leave, so he asked the chauffeur to take her to Shengyuan. Pei Chichi bit her lower lip and said, "Just go home directly." However, she was in a good mood today. She wanted to tell Tang Yu later that the medicine and rehabilitation method prescribed by Elon Fighter were really good. She tidied up her small bag and a white sports car came slowly from the front. It was the car that Tang Yu often drove. Pei Chichi was about to get into the car when the car window rolled down. The person sitting inside was not the chauffeur, but someone she saw, Shen Lian. Pei Chichi had heard of a saying that in this world, an ex-girlfriend was scarier than a mistress. However, she didn't particularly mind Shen Lian. She stood up and smiled faintly. "Miss Shen, what's the matter?" Shen Lian looked like a strong woman. She dressed appropriately and always looked meticulous. She had always been arrogant. She was the only daughter of the Shen family and was going to inherit the family business that was worth tens of billions. In her eyes, a young girl like Pei Chichi should be considered a lowly creature. If it weren't for Tang Yu, she wouldn't have had any interaction with Pei Chichi. Shun Lian looked up at the small villa behind Pei Chichi. Unbearably vulgar. Get in. She raised her hand and put on her sunglasses. Pei Chichi thought for a moment and opened the door to get into the car. After getting in the car, she took out her cell phone and called Tang Yu. Tell the chauffeur not to pick me up. I'll take a taxi later. What's the matter? Tang Yu was in a meeting. He answered the phone with one hand and didn't intend to have a long talk. Pei Chichi smiled. I'm with Shun Lian. Tang Yu was silent for a while, then said, don't talk for too long. With that, he hung up and continued with the meeting. He was not worried about Pei Chichi at all. His little friend looked very weak, but she was not a little girl who could be easily bullied. He had seen her hit Pei Huan, and even Ju Milin had been slapped by her. As for Shun Lian, she had once played an important role in his life, but it had faded over time. She was looking for Pei Chichi because she didn't want to give up. Tang Yu thought that maybe he should let Shun Lian know that they were in the past. Never to be together again. It wasn't that she had slept with Anlan, but that he no longer had feelings for her. After Pei Chichi hung up the phone, Shun Lian sneered, are you afraid that I will do something to you? No. I think that Miss Shun's life is much more valuable than mine. Why would you take the risk to do something so unprofitable? Pei Chichi looked ahead and said calmly, right now, if I want to die with you, I just need to grab the steering wheel from you. She paused. Let me tell you, I've never lost a fight. Shun Lian gritted her teeth. Why did Tang Yu find a wild girl like you? I don't know either. Pei Chichi suddenly leaned forward and whispered into Shun Lian's ear, maybe there's a beast living in his heart, and you don't know it. Shun Lian's car stopped abruptly, and she turned to look at Pei Chichi. This little face was very good looking and young, and there was an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Chapter 197. Pei Chichi didn't reply. Shun Lian continued, or should I say, do you know why he's with you? You should ask him. Pei Chichi spoke very slowly. Shun Lian narrowed her eyes. She had underestimated Pei Chichi. She had always been proud and arrogant, and she didn't want to argue with a lowly creature like Pei Chichi. Glancing at Pei Chichi, Shun Lian said softly, because he can't touch me. Pei Chichi, you're the first woman he can touch. Shun Lian's eyes were filled with mockery. I don't believe that you're in a normal relationship with him. There's only a physical relationship between the two of you. Pei Chichi laughed. What does my relationship with him have to do with you? A look of anger appeared on Shun Lian's face. I'm his girlfriend. Pei Chichi held the car door with her fingers. You're his ex-girlfriend. Miss Shun, don't waste your high IQ. With that, she opened the car door and got out. But when she opened the car door, Shun Lian was a little exasperated. She wanted to lock the car door, but ended up clipping Pei Chichi's hand. Pei Chichi groaned. Shun Lian unlocked the car door, but Pei Chichi's hand was already red. I won't apologize, because I didn't give you permission to leave. Shun Lian was the heir of the Shun family. She had been raised like a princess since she was young, and her family wasn't like Tang Yu's. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was a princess. Pei Chichi's hand was hurting, but she endured it. She didn't want to show weakness in front of Shun Lian. After getting out of the car, she turned around and looked straight into Shun Lian's eyes. Miss Shun, did you tell Tang Yu that you didn't give him permission to break up? Shun Lian was stunned. How could this be? In front of Tang Yu, she wasn't strong at all, because Tang Yu didn't fall for it. Tang Yu was not a man who would make do with girls. He had always been indifferent when he was with her. When she found out that there was something wrong with him, it was after 2 years of dating that she wanted him. One time, after drinking, she had taken the initiative, but after kissing and touching him for so long, he had no reaction at all. He was not interested in her. This was the biggest insult to Shun Lian. If it was any other man, she would have already humiliated him. But this person was Tang Yu. That noble Tang Yu. They tried many times, and in the end, he took the initiative. For a man, this was probably a very important thing. After about half a year, he gave up on her body. She knew that he had been looking for clean women to experiment on. On weekends, he no longer belonged to her. He was no longer her boyfriend. Instead, he was with different girls. He would look at those young and beautiful bodies and try to possess them. From then on, Shunlian knew that Tang Yu didn't love her anymore. No man would love a woman and still look for someone else at the same time. Moreover, did he love her? If he did, then why could he do the things that he couldn't do with her, with Pei Chichi? Shunlian sneered. She sat in the driver's seat with her back straight and arrogant. Pei Chichi, if there's you, there will be others. With your family background, do you think that Tang Yu will marry you? I've never thought about it. Pei Chichi held her injured hand and suddenly laughed. Miss Shun, I will leave him when you get married. Shunlian flicked her long hair and wound down the car window. The car sped away like an arrow released from a bow. This girl was extremely surly. She wasn't a little lamb at all. Chapter 198. Pei Chichi watched from afar as the white sports car drove away. It was only then that she felt a piercing pain in her hand. She pursed her lips and harumphed lightly. It was all his fault for attracting so many girls. However, she also knew that she had no right to blame Tang Yu. She was nothing to him. Just as Shunlian had said, how could he marry her? They weren't even from the same world. Pei Chichi walked slowly on the road, feeling a little cold. A taxi stopped beside her, and she got into it and went to Shengyuan. Tang Yu had been in a meeting the whole time. After she arrived, his second secretary, Xiao Rong, invited her into the CEO's office and told her that Tang Yu's meeting would end at around 7 o'clock. Pei Chichi nodded and called out to Xiao Rong, "Have you ordered a meal for him?" Xiao Rong was stunned for a moment before smiling. "Secretary Xiao will take care of this. He will probably order a meal for Miss Pei as well, unless the CEO has other arrangements." Pei Chichi nodded and went to the sofa to read a book for a while. Because her hand hurt too much, she could only hold it with one hand. After a long time, it was extremely uncomfortable, so she swung it a few times. However, Tang Yu ended the meeting early. He opened the door and saw Pei Chichi swinging her arm. "What happened to your hand?" He closed the door slowly and walked closer. Then, his expression changed. Although her little hand wasn't covered in scars, it was indeed injured. Pei Chichi looked at him and said softly, "I accidentally pinched my hand." Tang Yu's fingers held her injured hand, and he stared at her for a while before saying slowly, "It's Shunlian, isn't it?" Pei Chichi didn't say a word. She wasn't a saint. It was Shunlian who did the right thing. Moreover, what was the point of saying good things about Shunlian in front of Tang Yu? No one would be grateful to her. They would only think that she was a white lotus and would come to find her endlessly. Tang Yu's expression was very ugly. He went to the secretary's office outside and asked for a first aid kit. When he came back, he held her little hand. "Can you move? Are your bones hurt?" Pei Chichi shook her head. "I'm fine. It's just some superficial wounds on the outside. I'm fine inside." He glared at her fiercely. "If you're not careful, you're not a child anymore." She suddenly felt wronged. She was clearly his ex-girlfriend, and how could she guard against this kind of thing? Pei Chichi did not have the guts to talk back to him. She could only sit there with her mouth pursed and her face slightly turned away. This was already her protest. Tang Yu looked at her and reached out to pinch her little face. "You're not convinced?" "No." She lowered her eyes and remained silent. Tang Yu looked at her and suddenly felt a little sorry for her. She was with him and he was the one who bought her. So, now that she was being wronged, she couldn't be angry at him. He sighed in his heart. After treating the wound, he sat beside her and half forced her to his shoulder. Pei Chichi struggled hard, but she couldn't break free. Tang Yu's voice was a little deep. "Chichi, I've said it before. We're only staying for a period of time." She plucked up her courage on his shoulder. "You've also said that when you're tired of playing, Pei Chichi." He scolded her in a deep voice. Her voice became softer. "You're the one who said that. I also said that we'll get married when we're pregnant. Do you still remember that?" He turned his head sideways and looked at her with a cold smile. Pei Chichi buried her little face and didn't say a word. She hung her head low. Chapter 199. It was obvious that she wasn't ready yet. But Tang Yu felt that she liked him more or less. Whether a woman liked a man or not, she could feel it when they were having sex. These days, although she didn't take the initiative, she did enjoy it when he wanted her. In the past, he was the one who got the pleasure most of the time. Even if she had that kind of feeling, she was afraid of the matter between men and women. It was a kind of coping. These days, he really felt the union of soul and flesh. Bad child. He patted her little head and didn't say anything else. He had already laid out his feelings in front of her, and it was up to her to think about it. Perhaps, in her heart, she hadn't really let go of Jinrong. Tang Yu almost couldn't believe that he was so indulgent towards a girl. His pride didn't allow her to have someone else in her heart. But he tolerated it. In the past, he didn't tolerate Shen Lian at all. Perhaps it was because Chichi was young, so he let her have her way. But there was a voice in his heart that retorted, "You fell in love with her because you cared too much about her, so you could only tolerate other things even if you cared." Tang Yu tilted his head. "Let's go home." He ruffled her hair. "If she looks for you again, just ignore her." She let out a low "oh" and sat up straight. Tang Yu looked at her for a long time before he called out indignantly, "Bad child." With that said, he pulled her into his arms and started rubbing her. Pei Chichi's face was a little red. "Tang Yu, this is the office. Someone could come in at any time." But he didn't care and came in, determined to tease her. Not only did he rub her, he even lowered his head and kissed her little mouth, stumbling all the way to the office desk. Tang Yu waved his hand and all the documents on the desk fell to the ground. Then, she was carried to the office desk. The cold touch made Pei Chichi sober for a moment. Her clothes were already lifted up. His big hand was holding her little waist, and his breath was floating in her little neck. "Tang Yu." Her voice was extremely fragile because she could feel his excitement. He kissed her neck lightly, his voice carrying a hint of warmth. "Be good, don't move around." It was clear that he was the one who was moving. Pei Chichi really didn't dare to move recklessly. She was afraid that he would act recklessly, but she was afraid that he would really act recklessly. His lips went from icy cold to scorching hot. It was so hot that she felt as though she was about to burn up. She could only hug his arm with one hand and beg him weakly. When Xiaoran opened the door to the CEO's office, he saw this scene and immediately backed out, closing the door behind him. Her face was a little hot, because it was too shocking. The CEO had always been a cold person. Who would have thought that he would do such a thing? It was true. They were kissing, but they weren't far from that. No matter how quiet Xiao Ran's voice was, Tang Yu still heard it. His body suddenly tensed up. Then, he cursed under his breath and let out a long breath that was difficult to endure. Restraining his desire, he reached out to pull up her clothes and buttoned them up tightly. Pei Chichi was still trembling and didn't dare to look up at him. "It's been so long. Haven't you gotten used to it?" His voice was also extremely hoarse. Chapter 200. Tang Yu glared at her. "Pei Chichi, do you still have a virgin complex?" Pei Chichi didn't dare to. She lowered her eyes and said in an even softer voice, "No." She didn't dare to. Hence, Tang Yu immediately put on a superior attitude and said, "So you don't want it to be my first time?" This. Pei Chichi looked up at him with a hint of anger in her eyes. That wasn't the case at all. Her. He didn't put her down and made her sit on his desk while he stood in the middle. Pei Chichi bit her lips and turned her face to the side as she blushed. Tang Yu pinched her chin with his long fingers. "Chichi." Pei Chichi's face was burning hot. She rested her face on his shoulder and grunted. It was rare for Tang Yu to tease a young lady like this. He only felt that there was an indescribable beauty in her being treated like this. His Chichi wasn't a weak girl, but she was gentle and obedient in front of him. But occasionally, it would give him some surprises. Tang Yu only realized now that he really wasn't interested in strong women. What he liked was Chichi's personality. She was just right. She was a little afraid of him, but sometimes she couldn't help but resist a little. The way she waved her little paws, Tang Yu chuckled and hugged her little body. "Chichi, ha!" He looked like he had to get an answer. Pei Chichi leaned on his shoulder and smelled the fragrance on his body. Her face heated up again and she finally said in a low voice, "I hope." After she said that, she realized that she really didn't want him to have someone else's experience. She didn't want him to have done the things that he had done to her to someone else. Pei Chichi bit her lip and looked up at Tang Yu. Tang Yu patted her lightly and smiled. "Chichi, me too." She let out a cry, and he bent his head to kiss her again. This time, it was a very gentle kiss. Tang Yu had kissed her so many times, but this time, it was rare that he didn't use any love jade. He just sucked on her perfectly shaped lips and gently sipped them. After a long time, he finally let go of her. She didn't dare to look at him. She hugged his neck and threw herself into his arms. Her heart was beating fast, and so was his. Her little hand slowly lifted up and reached out to touch his Xiong's chest. "Tang Yu." She looked up at him. Tang Yu grunted in acknowledgement and looked down at his little girl. She didn't say anything, she just hugged him. At that moment, she knew that she would never be able to redeem herself. She fell in love with Tang Yu. She fell in love with Zhao Ku's stepson. Pei Chichi closed her eyes and hugged his waist. She said softly, "Tang Yu, let's go home, okay?" It was rare for her to be so clingy and proactive. Tang Yu's heart softened. He carried her down and held her hand as they went home. When they got home, Auntie Lee had already left, and the food was on the dining table. Tang Yu put down his briefcase. "Wash your hands and eat first." He had never thought that he would one day fall in love with such a domestic lifestyle. He ate and slept with a girl, and she read by the side while he dealt with work. He was such a cold person, but his mind was filled with so many things that he wanted to do with her. For example, having a child in the future. Chapter 201. Tang Yu turned his head to look at her with a puzzled look. Pei Chichi's little hands were unbuttoning his shirt. She rested her face on his shoulder and felt as though it was on fire. Tang Yu was a man. How could he not understand what she meant? However, other than that time when she had a fever in the rain, she had never taken the initiative when it came to sex. Tang Yu exhaled with difficulty. He lowered his head and asked in a hoarse voice, "Are you sure?" Pei Chichi's little hands were on his belt and she was unbuttoning it messily. He would not let go of such good luck. He raised his hand to unbutton his shirt and grabbed her little hand. "It's not what I want. Why aren't you moving?" He lowered his head to touch her forehead and asked in a hoarse voice. Pei Chichi couldn't avoid him. He could stick to her no matter where she turned her head. In the end, she panted and fell on his shoulder. "Tang Yu." Her voice was as weak and pitiful as a kitten's. He lowered his head and kissed her. Then, he carried her into the bedroom. After a few rounds of indulgence, she lay in his arms like a little beast. Her little hands were gentle and she was still restless. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at her. His voice was especially seductive in the dark. "Still want?" Pei Chichi's little hands were hugging him shamelessly. Tang Yu smiled. He knew that she had overdone it. He was in the prime of his life, while Chichi was still a child. Her body was not ready for so much pleasure. Hence, every time they did it, she would be so scared that she would cry in the end. She was too young and inexperienced. She was not a woman at all. Tang Yu felt pity for her. He looked up and kissed her. "Let's take a shower then." She replied with a millimeter. She felt a little uncomfortable all over. Especially, it hurt a little. Tang Yu carried her to take a shower and they had dinner together. Pei Chichi was so tired that she fell asleep just like that. Tang Yu sat beside her and looked at her. He reached out and gently brushed her hair aside. His actions were gentle, and then he held her little hand that was injured today. His eyes dimmed a little. He should talk to Shen Lian. He leaned forward and kissed Pei Chichi. When he looked up, his gaze was still lingering. In this world, there was only one little thing that he was willing to do everything for. Tang Yu walked into the changing room and changed his clothes. Sitting in the car, he picked up his phone and dialed a number. "See you in an hour," he said curtly, and hung up. Tingfeng was a bar in B City. Tang Yu would come here occasionally. He had been sitting in the corner for 10 minutes. He held a cigarette between his slender fingers and smoked it slowly. Shen Lian silently sat in front of him. Tonight, she wore a black dress with thin straps, which showed off her good figure and looked very charming. Tang Yu. She sat in front of him and took out a slim and long lady's cigarette. She leaned over slightly and lit it up. Then she took an elegant puff. Tang Yu looked at her with an unfathomable gaze. When did you learn to smoke? The day you didn't want me. Shun Lian smiled and lowered the cigarette. I learned a lot of things that day. Tang Yu, do you want to know? She raised her head slightly. There was a hint of provocation and seduction in her eyes. Chapter 202. Shun Lian's expression changed slightly. Did Pei Chichi tell you that? She's my girlfriend. Is that wrong? Tang Yu looked into Shun Lian's eyes. Don't look for her in the future. She's still young. Shun Lian narrowed her eyes and looked at Tang Yu. He was still indifferent. That matter between us is in the past. Shun Lian, let it go. Let it go. Shun Lian tilted her head and looked at him. Tang Yu, you've let it go, but I can't. She was upset and wanted to smoke again, but Tang Yu snatched it away before she could. Don't smoke so much. Shun Lian's hand quickly covered the back of his hand. Her eyes were a little blurred under the light. Tang Yu, he wanted to pull away, but she stubbornly refused to let him. Why her? Is she better than me? Shun Lian's eyes were hurt. I can accept you finding a virtuous girl from a prestigious family, but why such an unremarkable girl? Just because she's young and pretty. Tang Yu looked at her for a long time before he chuckled softly. Probably. At this moment, he also pulled his hand back and said seriously, We're done, Shun Lian. Anlan has been waiting for you. I don't love him. Shun Lian suddenly seemed to lose her temper and couldn't bear it anymore. But she immediately realized that she had lost her composure. She had always paid attention to etiquette and wouldn't lose her composure like this outside, so she immediately kept quiet. Tang Yu didn't say anything and just stared at her. Shun Lian calmed down a little and murmured, You've been with her for the past 2 years when I wasn't in the country. Tang Yu didn't say anything. There was no need to tell others about his relationship with Chichi. He looked at Shun Lian. Did you drive? I'll send you back. Shun Lian would not act like a shrew. She stood up quietly and said, I have a car. They walked to the parking lot together. The cars were parked side by side. When Shun Lian pulled open the car door, she turned to look at Tang Yu. You love her? Tang Yu paused and turned to look at Shun Lian. This answer was a little cruel to ex-girlfriends, especially those who hadn't given up yet. But if he didn't say it, it would be even crueler. He nodded slightly. Yes. What do you like about her? Shun Lian raised her eyebrows and asked mockingly. Tang Yu lowered his eyes. Under the waning lights, his eyes flashed with a touch of gentleness. It's probably because she's still young and not very obedient. Just based on the fact that he could touch her and just based on her good looks, Tang Yu would not be tempted. And, of course, the noodles under her, which also gripped his stomach. It should be said that Pei Chichi was very much to Tang Yu's liking. It was very comfortable to get along with her. Shun Lian caught the touch of gentleness in his eyes and forced a smile. Who hasn't been young before? When she was with him, she was also very young and had never seen him so protective of her. However, Shun Lian had miscalculated one thing. When Pei Chichi was with Tang Yu was already mature enough and naturally treated young girls differently. Tang Yu smiled faintly. Before getting into the car, he said lightly, Chichi is not like you. She has nothing. Don't bully her. Shun Lian smiled faintly. Really? But Tang Yu, what do you think I have? The Shun family's assets? Or something else? Tang Yu was indifferent and did not speak. Chapter 203. Tang Yu didn't answer her directly. He just said, I'm sorry. He quickly opened the car door and got into the car. Shun Lian just looked at him and watched his car leave. Before her tears could fall, she raised her head. In fact, she knew in her heart that Tang Yu wouldn't want her just because she had slept with Qin Anlan. He was such a proud man. When Tang Yu returned to the apartment in Xia City, Pei Chichi was still sleeping. She was curled up in the quilt, only her little head was outside. Tang Yu looked at her quietly. He sat down and reached out to touch her little hand. He knew in his heart that the reason why Shen Lian looked for him was because Shen Lian wanted to see him. And he really needed to make it clear to her. He knew Shen Lian's personality very well, and he didn't want Chichi to be wronged. He reached out and touched her little face gently. He wondered when she would grow up. He almost couldn't wait to propose to her. But she was too young. Would it scare her? Tang Yu smiled lightly. He actually felt a little happy. Shen Lian asked him if he loved Chichi. It should be love. He only knew that he had never liked a little girl so much. He wanted to give everything he had to her. When he saw her smile, he felt a sense of accomplishment. When he saw her happy that Pei Ming had reconciled, he felt that everything was worth it. When Tang Yu took a shower and returned to the bed in the bedroom, it was already 12 o'clock. Probably feeling his warmth, Pei Chichi automatically nestled in his arms. Tang Yu sighed softly and kissed her. She felt warm all over. Tang Yu. She woke up in a daze. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. He grunted, I went out for a while. Be good and sleep. Oh, Pei Chichi replied, then nestled in his arms again. After a while, she seemed to have thought of something. Daddy can speak simple words today. She wanted to share it with him. Although he was busy every day and might not take it seriously, she still wanted to tell him. Tang Yu was already a very important person to Pei Chichi. When Tang Yu heard this, he lowered his head and kissed her on the lips. That's good. Are you happy? To Tang Yu, even a small matter of hers was a huge matter. Yes. She nodded heavily and looked up at Tang Yu. I'm so happy that I'm going crazy. He smiled and stroked her hair, his voice a little husky. As long as you're happy. She rubbed her face against his chest like a little lunatic. Even though they had done it 2 or 3 times today, Tang Yu was still aroused. His gaze was deep. Chichi, don't even think about sleeping if you continue like this. Pei Chichi laid on his chest, purposely nibbling on a certain spot. Tang Yu let out a low grunt. Grabbing her hair, he pulled her onto his body. Pei Chichi lay in his arms, her little mouth on his neck. Her voice was muffled. It's okay if you don't sleep. This was a mess. He pinched her little chin and dragged her over. He looked at her deeply and said in a seductive tone, Pei Chichi, you do it. She bit her little mouth, looked at his beautiful and clean chin, and boldly planted her little mouth on his lips. Chapter 204. After a while, she hugged his neck and said in a low voice, Tang Yu, I don't know how to, then I'll teach you. He cupped her little face. Little girl, what do you want to learn today? She was so embarrassed that she turned her face away, but she couldn't escape. Tang Yu still tormented her for a long time. Early in the morning, when Pei Chichi woke up, Tang Yu was tying his tie by the bedside. When he saw her open her eyes, he smiled faintly. You're awake. Pei Chichi grunted in response. She grabbed the watch beside her and looked at the time. It was already 9 o'clock. It's Saturday today, Mr. Tang said slowly. Pei Chichi replied, what about you? Tang Yu smiled. There's an important meeting today. It'll end around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Chichi, are you going to visit? Uncle? Pei Chichi acutely sensed the way he addressed her. She sat there, feeling a little helpless. But in Tang Yu's eyes, she was extremely adorable. Her long black hair was messily draped over her shoulders. Her pajamas slid down, and there were bite marks on her snow-white shoulders. At this moment, she bit her lips and looked at him pitifully. Millimeter, then I'll pick you up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll eat out together. He leaned over and kissed her. I have to go to the meeting. Get up and eat something, Millimeter. With that said, he rubbed her twice again, and Pei Chichi blushed. Tang Yu chuckled hoarsely. He scratched her little nose and walked out. Pei Chichi got up and walked to the bathroom to brush her teeth in front of the mirror. But when she looked up, she was a little stunned. Was the person in the mirror herself? Her face was rosy and her eyes were blurry. She looked as if she had been loved. She was stunned, and her brushing her teeth slowed down. She recalled what Pei Huan had said to her. Pei Huan had said, Pei Chichi, you've fallen in love with Tang Yu. Pei Chichi brushed her teeth for a full 10 minutes. In the end, she almost forgot about the water. When she went out, her legs were a little wobbly. On one hand, it was because he had asked for too much last night. On the other hand, she was also a little dazed. Pei Chichi took a taxi to Qingshui Road. As soon as she entered, she saw Pei Huan watering the plants with a kettle. His stomach was obviously not big, but he kept holding it up in an exaggerated manner. Seeing Pei Chichi come in, Pei Huan sneered, "Pei Chichi, you still have time to come here today? Why aren't you looking at Tang Yu?" Pei Chichi ignored her, but Pei Huan stopped her. "Aren't you curious about what happened?" Her face was filled with malice. "I'm not curious." Pei Chichi's voice was a little cold. She really felt that Pei Huan was schizophrenic. Pei Huan giggled. "Pei Chichi, you must not have thought. Actually, all men are the same. Moreover, the other party is talented, beautiful, and the only daughter of the Shen family. You are probably just a spice for Tang Yu." She took a newspaper from the chair at the side and showed it to Pei Chichi. "Take a look, Pei Chichi. Cinderella is Cinderella. Once it's past 12, she'll show her true colors very soon." Pei Chichi lowered her head and looked at the headline of the newspaper. There was a photo on it. She could clearly see that it was Tang Yu and Shen Lian. They stood in the parking lot, staring at each other, and it was a perfect shot of them looking at each other. Chapter 205. Pei Huan felt that today's weather was especially good, and it was especially satisfying. This was because Pei Chichi was about to become a mistress. Shen Lian's family background could not accommodate Pei Chichi's status. Pei Chichi lowered her head and smiled. She put the newspaper aside. "I'm glad that you're so happy. Pei Huan, you have to keep it up. It's good for the baby." Pei Huan was furious. She glared at Pei Chichi. "You're going to cry." She just couldn't stand the way Pei Chichi occupied everything. Jinrong liked her. Even when Pei Ming was at home, he couldn't touch him. Sometimes, he would secretly look at Pei Chichi's photo. Wasn't she his daughter? Now that she was pregnant with the baby, shouldn't she treasure it even more? Pei Huan snatched the photo from Pei Ming's hands last night and cried in anger. Pei Ming only looked at Pei Huan. His body trembled, and he couldn't say a word. He looked a little scary. Later, Pei Huan ran out. She didn't see that Pei Ming's body was slanted on the bed. He moved with difficulty. He wanted to get out of bed to pick up the photo, but his legs couldn't move. He moved and moved until he fell off the bed. At this moment, Pei Huan blamed everything on Pei Chichi. She was extremely happy. She felt that Pei Chichi's life was coming to an end. But even so, her mouth was still so sharp. "Don't be too happy. I'll wait for the day Tang Yu chases you away. Let me tell you, the Pei family will not take you in." Pei Huan sneered and ignored Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi couldn't be bothered with her. Regarding Tang Yu and Shen Lian, she didn't trust them. But she knew that Tang Yu was not the kind of man who would flirt with his ex-girlfriend in the middle of the night. If he wanted to, he could have chased her away. He didn't have to do this. She walked into Pei Ming's bedroom. Pei Ming was sitting on the bed. He looked a little depressed. There were a few pieces of photo in his hands. "Dad." Pei Chichi saw that it was her photo and guessed what had happened. Her heart ached a little as she gently stroked his head. "Next time, I'll take a better photo." "Dad, throw this away." She gently pulled her hand away, but Pei Ming immediately tightened his grip and refused to let go. "Dad." Pei Chichi squatted down and hugged him. She suddenly said, "Dad, let's move out, okay?" Pei Ming heard this and looked up at Pei Chichi. "I was wrong." Pei Chichi stroked his swollen fingers and murmured, "I always felt that I should give you a good home, but I was wrong. They didn't treat you well." She owed Tang Yu a debt that she would never be able to repay in this lifetime. She could sell her body, but she could also sell her heart. Didn't Tang Yu want her heart? Then she should give it to him. Pei Chichi closed her eyes. This was the last thing she wanted. How could a person's heart be bought and sold? She owed Pei Ming. If she hadn't been so naive and believed Ju Mylin so easily, her dad wouldn't have ended up like this. It had always been her who was too weak. Pei Ming's lips trembled as his finger pointed in the direction of the door. Pei Chichi followed his finger and saw Ju Milin standing at the door with a pale face. Ju Milin was almost screaming, "Pei Ming, how could you do this to me?" She held a stack of documents in her hands and her fingers couldn't help but tremble. Chapter 206. But what did she see? He had given the company to that bitch, Pei Chichi, and she only had this house. There was a photo of that bitch in the safe. After so many years, that woman was still haunting her. Ju Milin felt as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over her heart. No matter what, she was Pei Ming's legitimate wife. However, he had given his heart to that bitch and the company to Pei Chichi. What about her? What did she have? She had nothing. Ju Milin stared at Pei Chichi like a dead fish. "You're here to collect the debt." Pei Chichi looked at the thing in her hand and then looked at Pei Ming. Pei Ming's fingers were trembling, and so was his body. He stared straight at Ju Milin. "Pei Ming, do you really treasure that bitch's child? All these years, have you been unable to forget her?" Ju Milin was almost screaming. She ran over and threw the will on him. She cried out, "How could you do this to me? Pei Ming, you bastard." Pei Ming could only look at her from the corner of his eyes, unable to say a word. After a while, Ju Milin suddenly reached out and grabbed Pei Ming's throat. Say something, you bastard." Pei Chichi tried to pull him away, but Ju Milin was so strong that she pushed Pei Chichi down. How could Pei Ming say anything? Ju Milin aimed at Pei Chichi again and tugged at Pei Chichi's hair. "You bitch, why didn't you die back then? Why did you have to live in this world to torment me?" Pei Chichi was in so much pain that she felt like her skin was about to fall off. She pushed Ju Milin away with all her might. Her scalp was numb. "Auntie, what are you doing? Dad needs to rest now. Why should I care about him? He doesn't care about me and Huan at all." Ju Milin looked like she was about to die. She sneered at the man who had been weak all his life. She really didn't expect that he would play such a dirty trick on her. Pei Ming was really a good person. He secretly gave the company to Pei Chichi. She screamed crazily, "Pei Ming, you think that Pei Chichi is a good person. You gave the company to her, but let me tell you." She began to laugh maniacally until tears came out of her eyes. Pei Chichi's voice was stern. "Auntie." Her heart was beating very fast. She knew what Ju Milin was going to say. At this moment, she even wanted to kill Ju Milin. However, Ju Milin had completely given up. She screamed hysterically, "Pei Ming, do you think that Pei Chichi is still your good daughter? Stop dreaming. When you were first hospitalized, I sold Pei Chichi. Now, she sleeps with men every day." She was crying and had a strange smile on her face. "Think about it. Your baby is pressed down by men every day and has to do all kinds of things. Isn't it painful? Isn't it uncomfortable?" Pei Ming's finger was raised and pointed at Ju Milin. He just stood there stiffly. His neck was stiff and his gaze was straight. He looked like he couldn't believe it. His eyes widened. His baby. Ju Milin. If he could, he wanted to strangle her to death with his own hand. How could she treat Chichi like that? She treated my baby. Chapter 207. She looked at Pei Ming and cried out, "Daddy, please believe me this once." I didn't. Pei Ming's finger was still pointing at Ju Milin. His finger didn't move an inch, and his gaze was, just like that, they froze, and then dissipated. Pei Chichi's tears didn't stop. With trembling hands, she dialed 120 and quickly called for an ambulance. Then, she threw herself on Pei Ming and reached out to help him smooth out the wrinkles on his face. But he still didn't move. She looked into his eyes anxiously. Her little hands grabbed his shirt, and her fingernails almost turned red, but Pei Ming couldn't respond to her anymore. He remained in his original position and didn't move an inch. He just stared at Ju Milin until her hair stood on end. At the door, Pei Huan's scream rang out. Pei Chichi was in a trance. She looked at Pei Ming's slowly collapsing body, and her vision was a blur. Pei Ming was dead. He died of a brain hemorrhage. In the chaos, Pei Chichi felt like she was being pushed around. She stumbled and fell into a warm embrace. She looked up and saw Tang Yu. She looked straight at him and said softly, "Tang Yu, Daddy is gone. I don't have Daddy anymore. I'll have nothing in the future." As she said that, her tears fell. She was in a daze, and it was as if she had been sucked dry. The emergency doctor gave her a death sentence, and the Pei family immediately held a funeral. Ju Milin was also stunned. She only wanted to get what she deserved, but she didn't expect to anger Pei Ming to death. That night, Pei Chichi sat there burning joss paper for Pei Ming. She was no longer unconscious. She murmured, "Daddy, I wonder if there will be a doctor downstairs, and if he can take care of your leg." As she said that, she sniffled and said, "What will Chichi do if you leave?" But she didn't know that she wasn't Pei Ming's biological son, but that man had given his love to her selflessly. Tang Yu stood not too far away. He watched as she knelt for half the night as if she did not know fatigue. She just knelt there without eating or drinking. All of a sudden, he felt a little envious. There was someone who could make Pei Chichi's heart ache so much. Walking forward, he carried her gently. "Chichi, take a break. We still have things to do tomorrow." Pei Chichi was stunned for a moment before she realized that it was Tang Yu. She pursed her lips and said very softly, "I don't want to rest. I want to accompany Dad. He's alone and very lonely." She looked at Pei Ming's coffin and said, "Tang Yu, I won't be able to see him anymore even if I want to. You still have me." He rested his chin on the top of her head, giving her a little warmth. Her body was small and thin, but she had endured so much. He wanted to give her everything, but sometimes he didn't know where to start. Her dependence on him was limited to what she was willing to accept. Pei Chichi listened to his words and was in a daze again. She turned her head and looked at him under the cold light. Even in a place like this, he still exuded a noble aura. Nothing could conceal his elegance. Pei Chichi smiled absent-mindedly. "Tang Yu, do you know that in this world, the person I can't like the most is you, hurting others and hurting oneself?" She silently muttered these words in her heart before her body fell limply. Tang Yu reached out to catch her. Looking down at her pale face, his heart ached slightly. Chapter 208. Their eyes met, and Tang Yu nodded slightly. "I'll take Chichi away first." Lin Jinrong didn't say anything. He just stood there. Tang Yu carried Pei Chichi back to Xia City. She woke up in a daze, but she didn't speak because she was overwhelmed with grief. In the dark, she cried hoarsely in his arms. Her tears soaked his shirt, making it wet and uncomfortable. But he couldn't let her go. That night, he held her in his arms and didn't let go. The next day, Ju Milin recovered. She didn't allow Pei Chichi to attend Pei Ming's funeral, but she didn't make it to the end with Tang Yu there. Pei Chichi held Pei Ming's photo in her hands. Looking at his smiling face in the photo, she was in so much pain that she wanted to die. On the day of the burial, the weather was gloomy. The cemetery was deserted, and it made one's heart feel heavy. Pei Chichi stood there and said to Pei Ming softly, "Dad, I'll fulfill your last wish for you." In the past, she was too weak. That was why Ju Milin had harmed her and her dad. After Pei Ming passed away, she thought about it a lot. It was because she wanted to give her dad a perfect family that he ended up like this. She wouldn't do it again. She wanted Ju Milin to pay the price. Her heart was filled with hatred. Ju Milin heard it. She clenched her fists tightly and said to Pei Huan, "See? Your dad's body hasn't even gotten cold, and this bitch is already plotting to steal the Pei family's assets." Pei Huan put her finger on the back of Ju Meilin's hand. "Mom, I'm here. She can forget about it." Just as she finished speaking, she met Pei Chichi's gaze. Pei Huan's heart froze, and so did Ju Meilin's. In the past, this bastard's gaze had already made people uncomfortable. Now, it made people shiver even though it was not cold. Pei Chichi ignored them. She closed her eyes and bowed 3 times respectfully to Pei Ming. "Dad, I'll protect the Pei family and everything you've built." She would take away whatever Ju Milin wanted. A week later, the Pei Corporation's senior management sat in the meeting room. Most of them were veterans who had worked with Pei Ming in the past. Ju Milin sat at the head of the table. She wiped her tears and sighed. "Old Pei left early, and you guys have been with them for so many years. I don't know much, so I'll need your help in the future. Although the current Pei group wasn't doing very well, they still had a breath left in them. Moreover, they couldn't let go of such a valuable piece of land. Zhu Meilin wasn't stupid. Many big companies had their eyes on the Pei Corporation. No, this piece of land, she was just waiting for the right opportunity and the right price to sell the company. Yang you would be. The directors were touched by her emotional performance. They nodded and said, yes, yes. Old Mr. Pei was good to us in the past. We will definitely support the company now. Zhu Meilin was comforted and forced a smile. Then I'll leave it to you all. Pei Huan was the one who came up with the idea. She couldn't drag on the company's affairs for too long. She had to calm these people down and secretly look for a buyer. She would sell the company at the first opportunity, lest that bitch Pei Chichi cause trouble. Just as Zhu Meilin was daydreaming, the meeting room door suddenly opened. The ones who entered were Pei Chichi and 2 lawyers. Chapter 209. Pei Chichi looked at the people in the meeting room before her gaze landed on Zhu Meilin. She said calmly, Auntie, I don't think you're aware of Dad's will. Zhu Meilin's expression changed drastically, but she sneered after a while. Your father passed away, so I should be the one to take over the company. Am I wrong? Pei Chichi inched closer to her. She looked into her eyes and said slowly, so you made Dad die because you wanted to take over his company. Pei Chichi, you're spouting nonsense. Zhu Meilin could no longer sit still. She raised her voice and said, get the security to chase her away. There was a hint of coldness in Pei Chichi's eyes. She threw a stack of photos on the conference table, and with a bang, the photos scattered everywhere. Auntie, after you see this, we can discuss whether you or me should leave the company. Pei Chichi sat at the end of the table and looked at Zhu Meilin coldly. Zhu Meilin looked at the scattered photos on the table and was stunned. Then she saw a large photo of her and Rong Lei. Her fingers trembled. This isn't real. These are synthetic. Pei Chichi, you traitor. You colluded with an outsider to harm me. Is that so, Auntie? Do you want your gigolo to come here himself? Then you'll admit it. Pei Chichi took out a recording pen from her pocket. She pressed a button and a sound came from the recording. Even if one turned to ashes, one could tell that it was Zhu Meilin's voice. That bastard is at home. He can't go anywhere. Don't do it in the car. Let's go get a room. Then there was the sound of a man and a woman doing something. There was also a hoarse male voice. What are you afraid of? It's more exciting here. They couldn't bear to listen anymore. What good could an old woman and a gigolo do? Zhu Meilin's face turned red and white. She was speechless for a long time. The senior executives looked at each other and didn't know what to say. Poor old Pei. He had always been a good person, but now he was trampled on by a slut. Pei Chichi looked to the side. Lawyer Zhong, can you announce Dad's will now? No one objected to Pei Chichi becoming the successor of the Pei Corporation. Zhu Meilin cried and screamed for a long time before being thrown out by the guards. An hour later, Pei Chichi sat in Pei Ming's office, caressing the things that belonged to him. A girl knocked on the door. Boss Pei, I'm old Mr. Pei's secretary. You can call me Little Wen. Pei Chichi forced a smile. All right, Little Wen. Bring the company's documents over for me to see. Little Wen pondered for a moment before saying, Boss Pei, you're still young. The company's situation isn't too good now. Should we hire a professional manager to manage the company? Mr. Pei had the intention to do so in the past. Pei Chichi knew that she meant well. Xiaowen was a few years older than her, but, if I hire someone to manage the company will never be able to develop. In less than a year, those people will persuade me to sell the Pei Corporation. Pei Chichi knew that many of those management companies were independent subordinates of big companies. Sometimes, they would be swallowed up as they were being managed. Little Wen nodded. All right, but there's a lot. In the end, she carried a stack of documents that was about half the height of a person. Pei Chichi couldn't understand them at all, but even so, she forced herself to continue reading. By the time she returned to Xia City, it was already 10:30 p.m. The moment she entered, she saw Tang Yu sitting on the sofa in the living room with a business magazine in his hand. Chapter 210. Pei Chichi stood there for a long time without moving. Slowly, she said, "Do you object?" Tang Yu was still sitting, but he raised his eyebrows slightly. "What about your studies?" In fact, he did not approve of her taking over the company directly. She was still young and inexperienced, so she could not manage a company properly. Moreover, he could not bear for her to work so hard. Pei Chichi looked down. "I want to take a break from school." Tang Yu frowned even more. He looked at her and did not speak for a long time. Pei Chichi bit her lip. "It's just a year off. When the company is on track, I'll go back and finish my studies. Is that okay?" Seeing that he was not saying anything, Pei Chichi walked over, squatted down, and leaned into his arms. She said in a low voice, "Tang Yu, I can't let Dad's life's work go to waste." Her little hand hung around his neck, and her voice became even softer. "I know you're doing this for my own good. I hope, but I have no other choice." She even lifted her head and kissed his chin. "Is that good?" Tang Yu looked down at her, his face expressionless. She was a little nervous. Pei Chichi did not know what she was feeling at that moment. She had nothing left, and now she could only hold on tightly to Tang Yu, the only man who could give her warmth. She was like an injured little animal, despairing and lonely. Tang Yu's fingers gently stroked her long hair, and then he bent down. His handsome face was pressed against her cold little face, and his voice was hoarse. "Chichi, why won't you let me help you?" She froze for a moment, then tightened her grip and pressed her face even closer to his chest. Then she said very softly, "Because I'm afraid I'll get used to it." Tang Yu did not say anything. These few nights, she could not sleep well at all, or rather, she did not sleep at all. Sometimes when he woke up and realized that she was not in his arms, he would put on his clothes and look for her. Often, she would hide in the washroom and just squat there, doing nothing, holding the music box in her hands. He remembered it was a gift from Pei Ming. She could sit there all night, holding that thing in a daze. He didn't force her because he could understand this feeling. He just carried her. "Chichi, it's time to sleep." Pei Chichi had developed a habit of hugging him and calling him daddy when she slept. This was a huge test for Tang Yu. He was a mature man, and he had his own desires. She was buried in his arms like this, and it was inevitable that he would want her, but she was so sad and called him daddy, how could he continue? Often it was he who kissed her, and then fiercely ordered her to sleep. In just a week, she had lost a lot of weight. Tang Yu caressed the little person in his arms. "Why are you afraid?" Pei Chichi closed her eyes and didn't say anything. She just hugged him tightly. Tang Yu didn't know. He didn't know anything. She did not dare to let him know. She was full of sins, and every moment that she was with him, she was on tenterhooks. She had nothing to lose anymore. She was afraid of having something, because the feeling of losing it was too hopeless. Pei Chichi moved her little face into his neck and bit his neck. "Tang Yu, don't be too good to me. Really, don't. I can't afford it." She had said this many times, but this time, she was in despair. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.